If you want to get the best out of the Insta360 X4, you must take a closer look at the settings, especially if the shooting conditions are not ideal. Today, I'll show you which settings work best depending on the situation. For good results, you should also pay attention to a few important things when reframing. Therefore, at the end of the video, I'll give you 3 important tips on the reframing process. Before we get into the recording settings, let's first take a look at the different modes and clarify which recording mode is best for which situation. If you tap on the camera icon, the menu appears in which you can select the respective shooting mode by swiping to the left and right. The selection depends on whether you are in 360 mode or in single lens mode. As you probably know, your X4 has 2 separate lenses with 2 sensors. The shots from both sensors are then combined by the camera to create a 360 image. If you select single lens mode, the camera will only shoot with one of the 2 sensors and one of the 2 lenses. But why would you want to do that? After all, the special strength of this camera is the 360 mode with the option to freely select the framing in post and the cool invisible selfie stick effect. There are 2 main reasons to take shots with the X4 in single lens mode. Firstly, you don't have to reframe the shots and can therefore use them immediately. And secondly, especially when the lighting conditions are difficult and unbalanced, you may be able to achieve better image quality with the single lens mode. This is especially true if one side of the camera is well lit and the other is not. In single lens mode, the camera can adjust the exposure to best suit one of the 2 sides. This is not possible in 360 mode. And then in single lens mode, shots can also be taken in 4K. A 360 shot that has been reframed can also be exported in 4K, but has an actual resolution of a maximum of 2.7K. Nevertheless, if the lighting conditions are consistent and good, there is hardly any difference in image quality between a single lens shot in 4K and a reframed 360 shot. After all, it's the same sensor and the same lens. And then there's the Me mode. Not only does the Me mode save you the reframing, the camera also automatically keeps you in the center of the frame and creates the invisible selfie stick effect, which is not normally the case in single lens mode. This is ideal for anyone who wants to film themselves and then immediately share the shot on their smartphone without reframing. However, if this is not the case, I would rather avoid it, as you can only edit the shot to a limited extent. Apart from the cases mentioned, you should prefer the 360 mode on the X4. Only in this mode can you benefit from the special strengths of this camera. In 360 mode, 2 recording modes are of particular interest to us today. Of course, the standard video mode and the Active HDR mode. If you want to take a hyperlapse shot, you can use the time shift mode. However, you can also create a hyperlapse using the normal video mode and then simply speed up the shot in post. And if you want to take a time-lapse shot, I can recommend the interval mode. In this mode, the camera takes several photos that you must later combine to create a video. However, the overall image quality will be better than with the traditional time-lapse mode. So when should you use the standard video mode and when should you use the Active HDR mode? For consumer cameras of this size, shots in which there are very bright and very dark areas in the image at the same time are a great challenge. The bright areas of the image often burn out and details are no longer visible. And it's precisely for these situations that the Active HDR mode is intended. It's designed to help preserve details in the very bright areas of the image. But I would really only recommend this mode if you find yourself in just such an exceptional situation and want to achieve the best possible result, because this mode also has a whole range of disadvantages. It's not suitable at all for taking shots in low light conditions. The image will contain significantly more image noise than in normal video mode. And the Active HDR mode also contains significantly fewer options when it comes to recording settings than the standard video mode. And we will now take a look at these recording settings in detail in standard video mode. The most important settings concern the resolution and the frame rate. Resolution and frame rate should be considered together, as the possible settings for the frame rates depend on the respective resolution. In the default settings, the camera shoots in 5.7K at 30 frames per second. However, 5.7K is not the highest possible resolution on the X4. In 360 mode, the X4 is capable of taking shots in 8K. And there is also the option of 5.7K+, which is the best option for you, also depends on the frame rate. You will get the best possible image quality with the X4 if you shoot in 8K, and the difference to recordings in 5.7K or 5.7K plus is visible, especially if you don't just watch your recordings on a smartphone. This is mainly due to the fact that you still have to reframe all your 360 shots, which basically leads to a strong crop of the image. An 8K recording has a resolution of around 2.7K after reframing. A recording in 5.7K has a resolution of around 1080 after reframing. So yes, the difference is visible and relevant. Now I could say, just always shoot in 8K. That leads to the best possible image quality. But it's not that simple, because 8K has two main disadvantages. The recordings generate very large files, and in 8K only frame rates of up to 30 frames per second are available. In 5.7K, on the other hand, you can shoot at up to 60 frames per second. We should therefore also think about the best frame rate. There is a first basic rule that you should follow. If you want to use your recording for a larger project, for example you want to use several clips for a larger video project, then you should ideally shoot all your clips at the frame rate at which you are creating your video project. So if you want to create a video project at 30 frames per second, then you should also shoot your recordings at 30 frames per second. If you want to create your project at 25 frames per second, then you should also shoot your clips at 25 frames per second, and so on. In general, the more frames per second, the smoother your video will look. 30 frames per second will therefore result in a smoother look than 24 or 25 frames per second. As professional movies are shot at a frame rate of 24 frames per second, this look is often perceived as cinematic. In most cases, a 360 camera like the X4 is used to capture action or special experiences in nature, so it's less about achieving a cinematic result. Instead, the aim is to create an immersive and natural look, and this works much better with a higher frame rate. You can achieve the most natural look with 60 frames per second, which, as mentioned, is only available in 5.7K. And that's the dilemma. You have to choose between the higher resolution of 8K and a higher frame rate. As I usually watch my videos on a large screen, good image quality is very important to me, and I create all my videos, including this tutorial, in 30 frames per second. I prefer 8K with a frame rate of 30 frames per second. But especially if you watch most of your clips on a smartphone and a smooth, natural look is more important to you than a higher resolution, then you should go for 5.7K 60. And there's something else you should bear in mind. In low light conditions, a lower frame rate will give you a much better result, as the camera has more time to capture light. In addition, you should favor 5.7K in low light. In low light conditions, you will get better results with 5.7K than with 8K, as the image noise is better removed at this resolution. By the way, you can find a detailed tutorial for the best settings in low light on my channel. So what is 5.7K plus for anyway? Just like 8K, only frame rates of up to 30 frames per second are available in 5.7K plus. But the decisive difference to 8K lies in the significantly smaller files. In addition, the image quality lies roughly between 5.7K and 8K. If you can therefore do without a higher frame rate and are prepared to accept minor compromises in image quality, then 5.7K plus is a good option, as it uses significantly less storage space than recordings in 8K. To summarize, this means for optimum image quality, 8K and 30 frames per second. For a smoother and more natural look, 5.7K 60. And in low light, 5.7K and a low frame rate of a maximum of 30 frames per second, ideally 24 or 25 frames per second. For just a slight reduction in image quality, but much smaller files, 5.7K plus. Let's move on to slow motion. With 5.7K 60, you can already create slow motion of up to 40%. That's quite nice, but for really cool slow motion shots, you need at least 100 frames per second. And for this, you need to reduce the resolution to 4K. But be aware, slow motion shots can sometimes look very cool, but unfortunately, they lead to a visibly poorer image quality on the X4. Even if at first glance the difference between 5.7K and 4K doesn't seem so huge. Resolution is not the only factor that determines image quality. Therefore, only use a frame rate of 100 frames per second if you are convinced that you will take an interesting slow motion shot. If you swipe left from the right edge, you will open the menu with the advanced capture settings. Here you can make adjustments using the automatic mode, or you can set the exposure completely manually. In other words, select manual if you want to determine the brightness of your shot yourself. In automatic mode, the camera will continue to try to set the exposure so that the shot is as well exposed as possible. However, you can also make certain changes in automatic mode. Let's start on the far left. Here you can set the color profile. You can choose between standard, vivid and flat. The main difference between standard and vivid is that the color profile vivid contains significantly more saturation. Standard leads to a more natural look, which I usually prefer. I would only recommend vivid if you like the high saturation and want to share your clips immediately and unedited on social media. Personally, the high saturation is a bit too much for me. If you want to edit the colors of your recordings a little more strongly, then you should use flat. The standard color profile is also suitable for slight color corrections, but a flat color profile has clear advantages for stronger corrections. Flat also results in a minimally better dynamic range. But as flat is not a real log profile, the differences are rather small. With EV or exposure value, you can set whether the camera should expose the image slightly brighter or darker. Depending on the situation, it may make sense to use a slightly negative value. This protects details in the very bright areas of the shot. Burnt out highlights cannot be saved. But if a shot is a little too dark, it's very easy to brighten it up in post. When it's dark, the X4 will increase the exposure time to capture more light. This leads to more motion blur and poorer stabilization. This can lead to jerks and jittering in the recording. If you want to avoid this, you can activate low light stabilization here. This leads to a better stabilization in low light, but also to a poorer general image quality, as a higher ISO value must now be used. Also don't forget to use a resolution of 5.7K in low light. To the right of the low light stabilization, you can set the white balance. The white balance determines whether your shot has a warm or a cool tone. But white should always look white and not yellow or blue. Setting the white balance manually requires some experience. In my opinion, the camera's automatic white balance works well overall, and I therefore usually leave it on auto. A manual setting could be particularly advantageous if you plan to take longer shots in consistent lighting conditions. The manual setting prevents the camera from changing the white balance during the shot for no real reason, which in the worst case could ruin your shot. On a sunny day, for example, a white balance of 5500 is recommended outdoors. The X4 must set the exposure and colors so that the images from the two lenses can be combined well and a balanced result is achieved. It becomes problematic when one side of the camera is very bright and the other side is rather dark. For example, if you have attached your camera to a chest mount and are pressing one lens against your body. In these cases, you may achieve better results with the balanced exposure feature than with the automatic mode. In such difficult shooting situations, it may also be better to hold the camera sideways against the light so that not only one of the two lenses gets all the light. We have now discussed all the settings in automatic mode. If you set the exposure to manual, you have two further setting options: the ISO value and the shutter speed. The shutter speed determines how long the individual image of the shot is exposed. The longer, the brighter the image will be. A low shutter speed therefore results in a brighter image. The ISO value determines how sensitively the camera reacts to the incident light. A higher ISO value leads to a brighter image, but also to poorer image quality. I would only set both the ISO value and the shutter speed manually in one case, in low light. And you should never forget that this camera, like most other action cameras, was made for daylight and good lighting conditions. Only in these situations will you get really good image quality with the X4. But if you want to get the maximum out of the X4 in low light, I recommend my low light tutorial for the X4. I'll put a link to it in the video description. As you can easily change the field of view when reframing, it's not so important which setting you use here when shooting. This is merely the starting point for reframing. However, the right setting can speed up the reframing process. I usually use Mega on the X4. This gives you a very wide field of view, whereby some of the distortions are corrected. Before we take a look at a few important tips for reframing, there are two more settings that I would like to discuss. To do this, you need to open the main menu and tap on the settings icon. In this menu, under image settings, two further settings are important for us. One is the setting for the video bitrate. This should be set to high. This is the only way to get the best possible image quality. I can only recommend standard if you really want to save storage space. And just below this, you will find the setting for the video sharpness. Your X4 produces a relatively sharp image. However, a large part of this sharpness is artificially created by the camera by increasing the contrast at the edges. This is known as digital sharpness. This makes the image look somewhat artificial. It doesn't look professional, and above all, you can hardly remove the sharpness in post. If you are therefore planning to edit your shots, I would recommend a sharpness of low. You can then add some sharpness in your editing program if the image looks too soft. But even if you don't want to edit your shots, I would reduce the sharpness to medium. You can also greatly influence the quality of your recordings when reframing. This is not intended to be a complete reframing tutorial. For a more detailed explanation of the reframing process, I recommend my X4 beginner tutorial. Today I just want to show you 3 things you should pay attention to in order to get the best possible quality when reframing. When you reframe your shot, you can freely zoom in and out. In general, the following applies. The further you zoom in, the more you crop the image. After all, you're trimming the image. The resolution is reduced and the reframed image basically loses image quality. But the further you zoom out, the more you can see the distortions. At some point, your shot will look like a sphere and your subject also gets smaller. That's why you have to find a balance when choosing the right framing. As I said, the field of view mega is usually a relatively good compromise. With underwater shots, distortions are less noticeable, but the dive case makes the shot look a little soft. In this case, for example, I would zoom out further. And the next tip also has to do with distortion. When reframing, make sure to keep your subject more in the center. Yes, for a good composition, the head should rather be at the top edge. But since the image shows the most distortion at the edges, this is not always the best decision for a 360 shot. The shot often looks better if you leave more space at the top. Okay, let's move on to the export. If you want to get a recording with the best possible image quality, you need to use the highest resolution and the highest bitrate when exporting. In the app, tap on Custom and select a resolution of 4K and a bitrate of 150 megabits per second. But you will only get the absolute best results when exporting with the desktop app, because only with the desktop app under Format can you select the format ProRes. And only this format guarantees you an almost lossless export. But be careful, the files will be very large. Okay, that was a bit much all at once. So here's a short recap. Really only use the single lens mode if you don't want to reframe your shot or if the lighting conditions are very uneven. As a standard setting, I would use 8K 30 for optimum image quality, 5.7K 60 for a more natural look. As color, use standard or flat if you are editing the colors. EV to -0.3 or -0.7. You should always reduce the sharpness to medium and even to low if you're editing your clips. Watch out for distortions when reframing and export in ProRes for the absolute best image quality. And one more important tip at the end. If you are often not satisfied with your 360 recordings, I highly recommend my video on the most common X4 beginner mistakes. You'll find a link to it and to the other tutorials I've mentioned today in the video description. By the way, there's a big sale on all Insta360 products right now. If you use the link in the description, you'll also get a free gift. The X4, for example, is 15% off and comes with a free bullet time kit. Give me a like as feedback if this video was interesting for you. There will be more videos on the X4, so stay tuned and see you next time.